I was 3 years old the last time I saw my mother's face. For 35 years, I believed she simply vanished that one ordinary afternoon. She walked out of my life and disappeared without leaving behind a single trace. No car. No note. No goodbye that made any sense. Just an empty space where my mother used to be. That's the story I grew up believing. That's the story everyone around me believed too. Until last month, when I stood alone in a dusty basement, pried open a hollow wooden panel, and pulled out an old videotape with my mother's handwriting across the label. What I saw on that tape didn't just answer the question I had carried with me my entire life. It exposed a secret so carefully hidden, so deliberately buried, that it took 35 years and one collapsing wooden board for the truth to finally come out. If you have ever lived with a question that never had an answer, if you have ever wondered whether someone you loved truly abandoned you, or whether there was a much darker reason behind their disappearance, I need you to stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what I discovered didn't just change how I understood my mother's disappearance. It changed how I understood her love for me, and just how far she was willing to go to protect me from a danger I never even knew existed. My name is Joy, and this is the story of the mother I thought I lost and the truth she left behind for me to find when I was finally ready to understand it. The last day I saw her, I don't remember much from the day my mother disappeared. Most of it exists in my mind, only as fragments, blurry static. The way old memories often are when you're only 3 years old. But one memory has stayed sharp and clear my entire life, no matter how many years passed. I was standing on our neighbor's front porch, clutching my stuffed rabbit against my chest. My mother knelt down in front of me, her hands smoothing back the hair from my forehead. "Be good for Lydia, okay?" she said softly. I nodded, holding my rabbit even tighter, feeling a strange kind of worry I couldn't explain. I was too young to understand why. I just remember feeling like something wasn't right. "I'll be back before dinner," she promised. Lydia, our neighbor, stood in the doorway behind me, wiping her hands on a checkered dish towel. She looked exactly like the picture of suburban safety, warm, steady, and completely ordinary. "Take your time," Lydia called out, smiling. "We're making cookies. Right, Joy?" My mother looked up at her and smiled back, but it was a tight, distracted kind of smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Then she leaned down and kissed the top of my head. "I love you so much, Addie," she whispered. I didn't see her again. There is one other memory from that final week that has never left me, even after all these years. During the days leading up to her disappearance, my mother was constantly arguing with someone over the phone. I remember snippets of her voice, sharp and frightened at the same time. I actually keep my promises. I once heard her snap into the receiver. Another time, her voice dropped into something fierce, almost pleading. "Don't even think about it," she said. She started locking herself in her bedroom during those final days. Once, when I needed her help with something small, I peeked through the crack in the door and saw her sitting on the edge of her bed, crying quietly into her hands. I didn't understand it then. I was far too young, but that image stayed buried somewhere deep inside me for the next 35 years, waiting patiently for the day I would finally understand exactly what I had witnessed. A few days after she left me with Lydia, the police arrived at our door. They didn't look like the confident heroes from picture books. They looked tired, awkward, and uncertain, the way people look when they already suspect the news they're about to deliver won't have a happy ending. They stood in Lydia's living room, holding their hats in their hands like men attending a funeral. "Mom, we haven't located the vehicle," one officer said. Lydia gripped the back of a kitchen chair tightly. "What does that mean?" "It means we're still looking," he replied. They asked her question after question that afternoon. I watched quietly from the hallway, still clutching my rabbit against my chest. "Are there any family members we can contact?" "No," Lydia said, her voice cracking slightly. Just the girl. The father. He passed away before the child was born, Lydia told them. That was the story I grew up believing my entire life. My mother's car was never found. There were no skid marks on any road, no wreck discovered in some quiet ravine, no evidence of a struggle anywhere. Just absence. Complete, unexplained absence. The woman who raised me, Lydia, ended up adopting me not long after my mother's disappearance, and she raised me as her very own daughter. To this day, I love her deeply for everything she gave me during a childhood that could have easily been filled with far more pain than it was. She was the one who cheered loudest at my school graduation. She was the one who cried happy tears at my wedding years later. She built an entire life around making sure that the little girl left on her porch that afternoon never felt unwanted or unloved, even for a single day. There is one memory from my childhood with Lydia that I have carried with me for years, one that only makes sense to me now. Looking back with everything I know today, I was around 8 years old, sorting through a box of old photographs with Lydia at her kitchen table, when I found a picture of my mother laughing on a beach somewhere, her hair loose in the wind. Was she happy? I asked Lydia. Before she left, Lydia paused for a long moment before answering, her eyes distant. Your mother, she said carefully, was the kind of happy that always had a shadow behind it, like she was constantly watching the door, even when she was laughing. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I simply nodded and moved on to the next photograph, the way children do. It wasn't until decades later, standing in a cold basement with a videotape in my trembling hands, that I finally understood exactly what that shadow behind her happiness had been. I moved away from our small town when I turned 22, eager to build a new life somewhere the streets didn't whisper my mother's story to every neighbor who passed by. I wanted a fresh start in a city where nobody knew about the vanished mother or the little girl left behind. The years that followed were genuinely good to me. I built a career I loved. I married a man who adored me completely. Together, we raised 2 beautiful children of our own, and for a long time, life felt settled, even peaceful. But there was one thing I could never bring myself to do, no matter how much time passed. I could never sell my mother's house. It sat there, 2 towns over from where I eventually settled, a quiet brick and mortar ghost from a life I barely remembered living. Every single year, Lydia would ask me the same gentle question. Have you thought about selling, honey? Not yet. I always answered. Selling that house felt like closing the very last door on the only proof my mother had ever truly existed. And no matter how many years passed, I simply wasn't ready to close that door completely. Then, last month, I received the phone call that would finally change everything. The call that brought me back. Lydia called me on an ordinary Tuesday evening to tell me she was moving into a retirement community. I won't be able to check on your mom's place anymore, or make sure the yard doesn't get overgrown, she said, her voice tired in a way I hadn't noticed before. Honestly, Joy, it's been taking it out of me for a while now. I didn't want to say anything before, but now, I understand, I told her gently. I'm sorry, Lydia. I should have realized how much this was weighing on you. For decades, without ever asking for recognition, Lydia had quietly guarded that empty house, mowing the lawn when it grew too wild, checking the locks after storms, making sure the last physical trace of my mother's life didn't fall apart from neglect. With her stepping back now, I knew I couldn't simply let the house continue rotting in silence. It was finally time to go back. The drive to my mother's old house took a little over an hour, and I spent most of it in complete silence, my husband occasionally glancing over at me from the driver's seat, sensing that I needed the quiet more than conversation. As the familiar streets came into view, streets I hadn't driven through in over a decade, a strange, heavy feeling settled over my chest. Something between grief and anticipation, though I couldn't have told you exactly what I was anticipating. When I finally arrived at the old house, the air inside felt thick with dust and forgotten years. I spent the first 2 full days simply cleaning the main floor, sorting through junk mail from decades earlier, wiping down countertops that hadn't seen a sponge in over a generation, opening windows that had been sealed shut for far too long. Finally, on the 3rd day, I made my way down to the basement. I hadn't been down there since I was a small child, and the space felt smaller, colder, and somehow heavier than I remembered. I was moving old cardboard boxes aside when I accidentally bumped into the wooden paneling covering the far wall, near the old furnace. A section of that wood felt loose beneath my hand. I knocked on it gently. Thump, thump. It sounded strangely hollow. My heart skipped in a way I couldn't quite explain. I pulled at the edge of the loose board, and it groaned softly before finally popping free in my hands. Behind it sat a small, dark opening, tucked quietly into the shadows of the basement wall. Something had been hidden there. Something that had been waiting patiently for 35 years for someone to finally come looking. The tape. I reached into the dark, narrow space, my fingers brushing against something cold and unmistakably plastic. I pulled it out slowly, carefully, almost afraid of what I might find. It was an old VHS tape. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, but the label across the front was still perfectly clear. In my mother's elegant, looping handwriting, it read, "For my beloved daughter." I think I genuinely stopped breathing for a moment. I remembered we still had an old VCR sitting in one of the upstairs bedrooms, the very same machine I had once used to watch children's movies on. Back when the tapes still worked properly, I didn't walk upstairs to find it. I ran. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with old cords, plugging the ancient machine into a small television that still worked. I pushed the tape into the slot, and the screen flickered instantly with static. My stomach twisted into knots. Then, slowly, the picture cleared. My mother appeared on the screen. I recognized her immediately, and the recognition hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Something inside me simply broke open. I had to press both hands over my mouth to keep myself from crying out loud. She looked so young, so real, so alive, even after 35 years of silence. She was sitting at our old kitchen table, leaning forward to adjust the camera in front of her. Her fingers trembled slightly before she finally folded her hands together on the table's surface, steadying herself. "If you're watching this," she said quietly, "then something has gone wrong." A cold shiver moved down my spine. "Lydia, I need you to listen carefully," she continued. My stomach dropped instantly. She wasn't speaking to me. Not yet. She was speaking directly to Lydia. "This isn't for Joy," she said. "She's too little to understand this right now. I left something else for her separately, but this particular message is for you." She paused, swallowing hard, gathering the courage to continue. "I lied to you, Lydia. I told everyone that Joy's father was dead, but he isn't. I did it to protect us both from him, but somehow he got my number again. He's been calling me for a week straight now." She let out a heavy, ragged sigh, one that carried the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting alone for far too long. "He also used my phone number to figure out which city and neighborhood we're living in. I don't think it will take him much longer to track down our actual address." She paused again to wipe tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. Watching this, my heart broke completely for a version of my mother I had never truly known, a young, terrified woman fighting silently to protect the child she loved more than anything. "He wants something I have," she whispered. "Something that could expose exactly who he really is. I'm meeting him tomorrow. In public, somewhere safe. I'm going to tell him that if he ever contacts us again, I'll go straight to the police with everything I know." A flicker of doubt crossed her face for just a moment, then disappeared, quickly replaced by a desperate, fragile kind of hope. "I believe he'll back down," she said quietly. "That single word, believe, has haunted me every single day since I first heard it. If he doesn't, if I don't come back," she continued, her voice breaking. "Promise me you won't let him take Joy. Use the documents to expose him." I hid everything down in the basement, behind the furnace panel. Second board from the left. Those words echoed inside my head long after the screen went dark. I also left something for Joy there," she added, her lower lip trembling badly now, as though she might collapse entirely. "Keep it for her until she's old enough to understand everything." The tape clicked off abruptly. The screen dissolved into blue static. The silence that filled the room afterward felt heavier than every single word she had just spoken. My father wasn't dead. He was the reason my mother had spent her final days crying quietly behind a locked bedroom door. But why? What could possibly be important enough for a man to make a mother disappear from her own daughter's life forever? What was hidden behind the furnace? I made my way back down to the basement immediately, my hands still trembling from everything I had just watched. The air down there felt colder now than it had only minutes earlier, though I couldn't be certain whether that was truly the temperature or simply my own body's reaction to everything unfolding around me. I looked toward the old furnace standing quietly in the corner. "Second board from the left," she had said. I kneeled down onto the cold concrete floor and pressed my fingers firmly against the wood. Nothing happened at first. I pressed harder, putting my entire weight behind it this time, and the wood finally shifted with a dull, scraping sound that echoed through the empty basement. I pulled the board completely loose. Wedged deep between the structural beams behind it was a plastic, wrapped bundle, clearly placed there with great care decades earlier. I reached in and carefully dragged it free, feeling decades of dust and grit fall loose into my hair as I pulled it out. I sat down on the cold basement floor and slowly unwrapped the bundle. Inside were documents thick, dense, and remarkably well organized, considering how many years had passed since they were hidden. There were bank account numbers, signed statements, and detailed records of wire transfers spanning several years. One particular name appeared again and again throughout the documents: Daniel. Was he my father? I spent nearly an hour sitting on that cold basement floor, sorting slowly through page after page. Some of the documents were financial statements, filled with numbers I didn't fully understand at first glance, transfers moving through accounts I had never heard of, signatures that didn't match, dates spanning almost 4 years before my mother disappeared. Other pages were handwritten notes, clearly my mother's own observations, carefully documenting conversations, meetings, and warnings she had apparently received from someone close to the situation. It became clear, even before I reached the letter at the top of the pile, that my mother had not simply stumbled upon something small or accidental. She had spent months, possibly years, quietly building a case, gathering proof, piece by piece, against a man powerful enough and dangerous enough to make her believe that disappearing entirely was the only way to keep me safe. Resting on top of the entire pile was a single folded sheet of paper. I opened it slowly, my hands shaking harder than before. It was a letter, written in my mother's unmistakable handwriting. "Joy, first of all, I want you to know that I love you so much, and that everything I did was to keep you safe. When you were just a baby, I discovered that your father, Daniel, was involved in serious investment fraud. When I confronted him about what I had found, he told me clearly that he would make sure I never saw you again if I went to the authorities. I left with you that very same night. I took the documents I had found as a kind of insurance, believing that if I had solid proof against him, he would simply stay away from us for good. I built an entirely new life for the two of us, and I told everyone in our new town that he had passed away. For 3 quiet years, I truly believed we were safe. But then, he found us again. I've told him repeatedly that I won't use those documents against him, so long as he leaves us completely alone. But he wants some kind of absolute guarantee, something more than my word. If you are reading this letter, It means I did not get to come home to you. I am so deeply sorry, my sweetheart. I only ever wanted to protect you. I sank back onto the cold concrete floor, the letter slipping loose from my fingers and fluttering gently onto my lap. For 35 long years, I had wondered endlessly what truly happened to my mother. And now, finally, I held one solid piece of the truth in my trembling hands. It was up to me now to make things right. Taking the truth to the light the next morning, I gathered everything, the documents, the letter, the videotape, and drove straight to the local authorities. I expected chaos. I expected a media circus surrounding a story that had gone cold for 35 years. Instead, the investigation moved forward quietly and methodically. Old records were carefully pulled from dusty archive rooms. Dormant complaints from decades earlier were carefully cross-referenced with the names listed throughout my mother's hidden documents. 2 months passed in a blur of waiting, hoping, and trying to hold on to some sense of normal life. 2 months passed in a blur of waiting, hoping, and trying to hold on to some sense of normal life. During those months, I found myself returning again and again to that old videotape, watching my mother's face flicker across the screen late at night after my husband and children had gone to sleep. Each time, I noticed something new: the way her hands trembled slightly when she mentioned Daniel's name, the way her eyes kept flicking toward the window, as though she expected someone to appear there at any moment. I also spent several evenings simply sitting with the letter she had written me, reading it over and over until I had nearly memorized every word. There was something deeply comforting about holding physical proof of her love in my hands, even if that proof had arrived 35 years later than I ever needed it to. Then, one afternoon, while I was sitting quietly in my office, my phone rang. It was the lead investigator assigned to the case. "Joy, we've located Daniel," he said. "He's currently in custody, and we're moving forward with charges related to the fraud your mother uncovered all those years ago. And we're formally reopening your mother's disappearance case as well." I closed my eyes and leaned back slowly in my chair, feeling something heavy finally begin to lift from my chest after 35 long years. "Thank you," I whispered. The mystery that had quietly defined nearly my entire life was finally beginning to unravel, one careful thread at a time. I drove straight to Lydia's new place the very next morning and sat down with her at her small kitchen table to tell her everything I had discovered. When I finally finished speaking, she shook her head slowly, tears welling up in her tired eyes. "She never told me any of this," Lydia said softly. "I swear to you, Joy, I had absolutely no idea what she was truly facing." "I know," I said gently, reaching across the table to take her weathered hand in mine. "She wanted to protect you too, Lydia. Not just me." Lydia squeezed my hand tightly, her voice thick with emotion. "She loved you more than anything else in this world. Honey, I hope after everything, you finally know that for certain now." "I do," I told her, meaning it completely for the very first time in my entire life. What 35 years of silence taught me in the months that followed, as the investigation moved steadily forward, I found myself thinking constantly about the woman on that videotape, young, frightened, and utterly determined to protect her daughter no matter what it cost her personally. For 35 years, I had unknowingly carried a story that wasn't true, a story about a mother who simply vanished, who perhaps didn't care enough to stay, who left without explanation because something inside her simply gave up. That story, though never spoken aloud as an accusation, had quietly shaped parts of how I understood love, trust, and abandonment throughout my entire adult life. Learning the truth didn't erase 35 years of unanswered questions. It didn't undo the childhood I spent without her, or the wedding day she never got to witness, or the birth of my own children that she never got to celebrate alongside me. Some losses remain permanent, no matter how much clarity eventually arrives to explain them. But learning the truth did something else, something equally important. It replaced an empty, aching silence with an entire lifetime of proof that my mother had loved me fiercely enough to risk absolutely everything, including her own safety, simply to give me a chance at a life free from danger she alone had to face. She hid documents behind a furnace panel, not because she was running from her responsibilities, but because she was running directly toward protecting me, even in the darkest, most uncertain moment of her life. She recorded a message on an old videotape, not knowing whether anyone would ever find it, simply because she refused to let her daughter grow up without at least the possibility of one day understanding the full truth. That, I have come to believe, is one of the purest forms of love that exists, the kind that keeps working quietly to protect someone, even from beyond the reach of time itself. Daniel, for his part, spent 35 years believing he had successfully buried his crimes along with the woman who once threatened to expose them. He built whatever life he built afterward on the assumption that silence, once achieved, would remain permanent. He was wrong. Truth, much like love, has a way of waiting patiently in hidden places, ready to resurface exactly when it's needed most. I think often about how differently things might have turned out if that wooden panel had never come loose beneath my hand, if Lydia had never grown too tired to keep watching over that empty house, if I had simply sold the property years earlier the way so many people around me had gently suggested. The truth had been sitting quietly in that basement the entire time, patient and undisturbed, waiting for exactly the right moment to be found. That realization has changed the way I think about grief itself. For 35 years, I grieved a woman I believed had simply walked away. Now, I grieve a woman who fought fiercely until her very last day to protect me, and somehow impossibly, that grief feels lighter to carry, even though the loss itself remains exactly the same size it always was. The lesson I carry forward, if you are watching this today, and you are carrying an unanswered question about someone you loved and lost, a parent who left unexpectedly, a loved one whose absence never made complete sense, a piece of your own history that has always felt incomplete, I want you to remember Joy's story, and I want you to remember her mother. Sometimes, the people who disappear from our lives did not do so out of carelessness, indifference, or a failure to love us enough. Sometimes, their absence is the direct result of a battle we never fully saw them fighting, a sacrifice made quietly, without any expectation of recognition or reward. And sometimes, the truth does not arrive on the timeline we would prefer. It waits behind a hollow wooden panel for 35 years. It waits inside an old videotape gathering dust in the dark. It waits patiently for the exact moment we are finally ready, strong enough, and prepared enough to receive it. The most important lesson I have taken from all of this is simple. Even though it took me 35 years and one dusty basement to fully understand it, love does not always look like presence. Sometimes, the deepest love looks like sacrifice, quiet, hidden, and completely selfless, given by someone who was willing to disappear from a life they desperately wanted to stay in, simply to keep the person they loved safe from harm. My mother did not abandon me. She protected me in the only way she believed she could, and she left behind every piece of proof she possibly could, trusting that one day, when the time was finally right, the truth would find its way back into my hands. It did. And now, it is my responsibility to carry that truth forward, not with anger toward the years I lost, but with gratitude for the love that never stopped working to protect me, even in silence, even across 35 long years, even from a place I could never fully see. I think, too, about Lydia, and everything she gave without ever asking for recognition. She raised a child that wasn't biologically her own, without complaint, without resentment, and without ever once making me feel like anything less than completely hers. When I told her the truth about what had really happened all those years ago, she didn't focus on her own shock, or the years she had spent believing a story that wasn't entirely accurate. She simply held my hand and reminded me, gently, that love, real love, doesn't require every detail to make sense in order to remain real. That, perhaps, is the final lesson this story leaves me with. Whether it was my mother, hiding documents behind a furnace to protect a daughter she might never see grow up, or Lydia, quietly guarding an empty house for 35 years without ever being asked to, the people who love us most rarely do it loudly. They do it in the details nobody else notices until, one day, those details are all that remain to tell the true story. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If Joy's journey moved you today, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you believe that some of the deepest expressions of love are the quietest ones, the ones we never fully see until decades later, stay with us, because there are many more stories like this one still waiting to be discovered. This story is inspired by real experiences. To protect everyone's privacy, certain names, locations, and details may have been changed, while the heart of the story remains true.